Hey everybody, how would you like to meet and hang out with Alex Filipenko? He's the Nobel Prize winning physicist and cosmologist at UC Berkeley who discovered that the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate. Well, you can meet him and hang out with him. Coming up in our next Geo Tour, May 1st through 12th, 2025, along the Atlantic coast, West Africa to Lisbon, exploring the Canary and Madeira Islands. These are geo-tours. In these tours, we always have a special guest lecture. This one is Alex Filipenko. I know Alex. He's a great guy. Super interesting intellect, great lecturer, and he is the guest lecturer on this. So you'll go to all these cool islands on a cruise ship. The way it works, because I've done a bunch of these myself, is you just don't meet that person. You get to hang out with them, like breakfast, lunch, dinner, at the bar late at night, on the little excursions to the islands and so on. And so not only are you going to see some of these great UNESCO sites at the Canary Islands there, you get to hang out with a Nobel Prize winning physicist and cosmologist and learn and talk about why is there something rather than nothing? Where did the Big Bang come from? What's the ultimate fate of the universe? How cool would that be? Check it out. Go to skeptic.com and just click on the box there for our geo tours and cruises and sign up.
I mentioned being a cultural Christian. That's an interesting phrase because, when Ayaan Hirsi Ali came out a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago now, as a Christian, she was one of the most famous atheists in the world. And then she explained the reason she did this, well, at least initially, was that at least the Christians will stand up to the Islamic terrorists and extremists that, want to destroy Western culture or whatever. And then she said, well, there was also personal reasons for it. Anyway, Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most famous atheist, said, well, I guess I'm a cultural Christian in the sense that, I was born and raised in a Western country, Great Britain. And and we were a Christian nation. And so, yeah, I guess I am culturally that. So I guess I would have to say, born and raised in America, yeah, I guess I'm a cultural Christian in some kind of loose sense that we're floating around in a culture that's mostly Christian. And that's what you mean by America is a Christian nation, even though really officially it's not. It's a secular, as a government, it's supposed to be secular. It's supposed to have separation of church and state. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about it.
Well, I mean, I just think anyone who sort of is seriously thinks that firewall is intact at this moment in time, when we have 22 states enacting like very specific religiously inspired, openly religiously inspired policies to rob women of bodily autonomy, when we have all of these religiously inspired laws to limit sex education, to limit the rights of trans people and trans kids. I mean, this is a moment in which the Christian right is flexing its power and not hiding that their policies are very much motivated by God and by religion. And while that may be particularly apparent to me as someone who never had a vision of Jesus revered in her home, that kind of stuff becomes, when you just see how often Jesus, Christianity, Christian morality, the sort of notion of Christianity as goodness are unconsciously evoked in every sphere of American public life, from, culture to certainly politics, in ways that concretely affect the lives of millions of people. I think it's undeniable, that like the Christian religion, and especially the sort of most radical elements of it, have a tremendous amount of daily influence on the lives of, if not a plurality, then certainly a significant proportion of the population.
Yeah. The evangelicals you encountered personally and interviewed, and the literature that you read, which is extensive, everybody knows about the separation of church and state and that it's supposed to be a secular government. Is it your sense that they just believe so strongly that they have the truth, they have the one true religion, and therefore, in a way that triumphs over the secular government. In other words, they're true believers. You make this point in your book many times. These people actually believe what they say. So we should listen to them because they're telling us what they're really thinking. Yeah, okay. But I always wonder, but you realize our government's secular, right? So why are you imposing your religious beliefs on me? I'm not a Christian. So, and you wouldn't want that if Islam was the dominant religion in America, that they now have the reins of power in politics. You wouldn't want that, right? No, of course not. So what is your sense of what they're thinking? Like, we have the truth and therefore it's our obligation to spread it through legal means?
Yeah. I mean, their aim is explicitly a theocracy. If you look at, again, and yeah, I mean, the point about sort of the easiest way to know what someone is thinking is to look at what they say and what they do, is sort of the general thesis of this book. And that a trap that people often fall into is something I talk about as like measuring your, someone else's wheat by your bushel. Like my sort of rational, agnostic, East Coast, whatever, like viewpoint is not the viewpoint that millions of Americans take, and there are many other motivations and mindsets that form political motivators, often powerful political motivators. But yeah, like look at someone like Mike Johnson. You think that guy like cares more about, this like an ideal of separation of church and state versus imposing his own religious values on America? Absolutely not. He's a fanatic, and he's the Speaker of the House. So we're not talking about marginal figures here.
Yeah.
Let alone when you go down to state houses and legislators. Like, absolutely, yeah, they talk all the time about establishing a kingdom of God on earth, about, proselytizing to like unbelievers. And these laws, again, are just religiously rooted, and they are causing the deaths of women all over this country right now, right as we speak. Women are bleeding out in parking lots because of laws motivated by Christian theology.
And what is your sense of how many, I don't know, Christian right people or people in America who identify as being a member of the Christian right? In other words, maybe there's some Christians that are kind of centrist and they don't buy into most of this stuff. They're more libertarian in their social policies, for example, social politics. In other words, we have multiple buckets we could put people in. The people you're focused on are definitely the extremists, for sure. And they are in positions of power. Yes, so we should pay attention. This could be a problem. But how big a problem is it is my question. It's harder to say. Maybe there's some polling data on this, or what is your sense of that?
Yeah. So if you look at, demographic data, it's about white evangelical Protestants, and people who sort of consciously identify with that identity are very, very, very likely. I mean, we're talking like 80% and higher to identify with this sort of very right-wing political ethic, very interventionist, like the panty-sniffing government in your bedroom kind of political ethic. That's about 14 million people. Or no, that's 14% of the population. So, and then add to that a substantial swath of the Catholic right, which sort of joined together with the Protestant right in the 80s and onward, with figures like Phyllis Schlafly, Paul Weyrich, Leonard Leo, and we're looking at, tens of millions of people. This is not, it's not a majority. It's not anything close. It's not a plurality either. But what it is a very focused and determined political force that's been organizing for 50 years. So demographically, it's a significant number. We're talking about like a great deal of people. But even beyond that, they definitely punch above their weight demographically. I mean, this 14% of the population wind up making up, so many so many state house positions, gubernatorial positions, wind up disproportionately elected to Congress, because this is a very, again, like electorally focused, electorally unified populace that has very consciously married the church and politics for 50 years, and as such has gained, a really disproportionate influence over Republican ideology, Republican priorities, and are overrepresented in power. If we're talking about religious minorities with a nefarious agenda who want to remold the country drastically, people point at the Jews, but I'm like, you're looking in the wrong place.
Maybe give us a brief history of how this happened over the last 50 years. I mean, if you think back, say, post-World War II, Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, I mean, they weren't uber religious evangelicals, wear it on your sleeve. It wasn't really until W. Bush, even H.W. Bush was pretty quiet about his faith. It wasn't really until this century that it became, like, it seems like it became a big thing. I know Reagan was heavily influenced by the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and that crew. I just had Max Boot on the show talking about his biography of Reagan, and that, in fact, when Reagan was governor of California, he passed the most liberal policies about abortion in the country. And that, he wasn't uber religious. He wasn't, uber anti-abortion and all that stuff. Something happened in the 80s, let's say late 70s, 80s, until today, where it's been a big shift. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll try to elevator pitch it, condense this, because it's a complicated story.
Yeah.
But essentially, there's this there's this very large population of Southern Baptists in particular, but, conservative Christians in the South who were temperamentally conservative, who were sort of observing McCarthyism with approval, who were scared of the Reds and the Bolsheviks and the godless lefties, right? But they weren't particularly politically active at all. They were, they viewed politics as sort of grimy and worldly, and that pertained for up till the first couple of decades after World War II. And then actually the impetus for the rise of the Christian right, and Randall Balmer, who's a wonderful writer and historian, documents this very persuasively. In particular, the real impetus for the waking of this sleeping dragon of political activism among conservative Christians was not, in fact, abortion. In fact, as late as 1974, the Southern Baptist Convention voted in favor of legal abortion. They viewed abortion as a weird fringe Catholic issue. It was not central to their ideology at all. What really happened was Brown versus Board of Education. So in response to court-ordered desegregation of public schools, immediately just a huge amount of parochial schools with Christian in the name, with church in the name, popped up all over the South. Meanwhile, you had mass withdrawals of white students from, in many cases, entire counties' school systems, with cratering of revenue, cratering of services provided, and you had this alternate education system through the church being set up in order to preserve school segregation. So what happened was, in the 70s, one of the there was sort of a landmark Supreme Court ruling, Green versus Connolly, that said, a religious school that is segregated cannot receive tax exemptions and is not a charitable organization. And that, was even sent to, there's even going to be an IRS investigation of Jerry Falwell's, Lynchburg Christian Academy. There were, Bob Jones University at this time lost its tax exemption, and that was highly publicized and politicized. And this, above all, was the single radicalizing element of the Christian right. So it was this commitment to sort of the George Wallace segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That was the single motivating factor. And then in the 70s and 80s, you had really savvy figures like Phyllis Schlafly, like Paul Weyrich, and like Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, Ralph Reed, right? Sort of realizing, well, okay, if we want to present ourselves as sort of the moral guardians of America, if we want to be palatable to a broader audience than, already committed segregationists, which is not the majority of the population, we need to sort of change our image. We need to change our central focus. And so while retaining a very intense degree of racism and segregationism, which you can see from, for example, George Wallace's appeal to Christian voters, and from Nixon's Southern strategy, among other things, they shifted their focus to being much more about sexual morality, about, opposing the various social revolutions of the 1960s. And while they had always sort of been naturally a reactionary population, so this was in some ways authentic, but you had a real shifting of the stated goals and a shifting of public image and a very successful sort of self-presentation as we're just like the concerned guardians of America's soul, against the godless feminists, against the gays, against the students who are out of control youth because we don't discipline our kids like we used to. And so you have the rise of this sort of biblical parenting movement, basically how to beat the crap out of your kids for God, as a direct response to the student uprisings of the 1960s.
So it's really in response to cultural trends over the last 50 years in which they want to nudge things back toward a more biblical worldview. Then here's a mystery that I still haven't got a good answer to, and I'm not sure anybody does, but I'll ask you, why Trump? I mean, just go back to, say, 2015, when you had real Christian Republicans. I mean, Ted Cruz is the real deal. I mean, he really believes. Or in 2020, Mike Pence. Or, I don't know, Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush. I mean, these are real mainstream center of the bell curve Republican, GOP, and Christians. Nobody really believes Trump believes any of the stuff you're talking about in this book. I mean, he's just an opportunist and so on. How is it he beat all those mainstream GOP, Republican, conservative Christians? I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, the 2016 Republican primary was certainly an interesting time. You had sort of this idea post the 2012 loss of a presidential election of, let's reorganize, let's stop being so racist and hostile to immigrants. Maybe let's focus on fiscal conservatism, lots of stuff. And then Trump comes out and he's coming out swinging. He's a showman, right? He has these Borscht Belt sort of populist instincts. He's funny. He's mean. And everyone else looks kind of like a stuffed suit beside him, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's not as sharp as he used to be, but if you remember, back in those Republican primary debates, it was always what's he going to say, right? He's, oh my God, I can't believe he talked about Marco Rubio having a small dick or whatever.
That's right. I forgot about that. Yes.
And so one thing that's important to note about the Christian right is that they always have realpolitik on their minds. So they're going to back a winner. And the theological justification can be sort of back reasoned from that knowledge. So, it was a sea change. There was real enthusiasm for Trump. He kept winning. And so, the Christians are going to back a winner. And so you see a lot of really interesting theological sort of justifications for this, even in the aftermath of the Access Hollywood tape, where he's like, I sexually assault women. It's like, oh, how are they backing this guy? And first of all, I would say hypocrisy is always is an accusation often levered from a place of weakness, or perhaps just to say that hypocrisy is only valuable as an accusation when the person who you are accusing of hypocrisy views your viewpoint as valuable. And I think that is emphatically not the case when it comes to the Christian right and everybody else. If you believe you're fighting a holy war, pretty much anything is justified. A multitude of sins are justified. One thing that I did find interesting is that a number of sort of charismatic evangelicals, people who believe in sort of modern day prophets, started advancing this theological theory that I think also did gain some traction in other elements of evangelical culture, is that Trump is a reincarnation of the Emperor Cyrus, who was the Persian heathen emperor that enabled the Jews to return to Israel and build the second temple in, I don't know where, whatever, something BC, early BC. So he is this flawed vessel, this heathen, this pagan, who nonetheless becomes the instrument of God's will. And, one of these sort of fast-talking prophet types is like, oh, there's a prophecy about Cyrus in Isaiah 45, and Trump would be the 45th president. And so, 45 is Cyrus. And this was actually advanced in a lot of different Christian circles in 2016. This idea of the flawed vessel who nonetheless is going to be the one that's going to muscle through God's agenda. And in many ways, that theological view has been internally vindicated by, for example, the overturning of Roe versus Wade.
Mm-hmm.
And, all the moving of the embassy, the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and other sort of explicit Christian right pandering agendas. So the question is not, is he a true believer, which obviously he isn't, but rather, will he enact our agenda? Will he acknowledge his debt to believers? And yeah, he has. I mean, it's a very straightforward relationship.
Yeah. In other words, it would be something like, if we back a loser, we're not going to get any of the policies we want enacted in Congress and in the law. So we'll, sort of hold our nose and pull the handle for this guy, because at least he'll get us the judges we need to overturn Roe, which is what I was told back in 2017 when I asked Christians about this. How can you back this guy? Well, he's going to get us the judges. And he did.
I mean, there's that, but it's also just like not even holding your nose, but just saying power is what we want. Accumulation of power is what we want. And so there's not even an element, there's no element of like self-disgust or whatever when it comes to winning a holy war, which is really, when we talk about the doctrine of spiritual warfare, which is really the underpinning of so much of modern evangelical life. So you are in a holy war. You and I are also in this holy war, even if we didn't sign up for it, or, we weren't like, cool, I'm signing up for it. We're spiritual enemies of the soldiers of Christ and light. And that happened, as soon as we opened our mouths and we're like, hey, women shouldn't die of sepsis, or like, hey, it's bad to beat your kids. You know what I mean? Like, just because we don't believe in the basic tenets of spiritual warfare doesn't mean that for the people who do, people like us are not sort of viewed as agents of darkness.
Yeah. You open your book with a number of topics that we discuss in Skeptic and debunked back in the 90s, the Satanic Panic, McMartin preschool case, the recovered memory movement, multiple personality disorder, demon possession, and exorcisms. These are all examples of the belief in a kind of dualistic worldview in which there is a supernatural element to reality. There is not only a God, but a Satan, and that they are at war, not in some other place or dimension, but here. There's spiritual battle here on earth, and that the, say, witch trials of Salem in those battle days are not really gone completely. But they've moved it more into the political sphere, I guess, rather than direct witch hunts. But I really think the Satanic Panic was a kind of witch hunt. And so the people you've encountered seem to truly believe in this, like a Manichaean worldview of good and evil, not in some metaphorical sense or mythical sense, but in actual literal, there is a Satan and demons are at work and there is evil in the world that really exists and we need to fight that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the most fascinating texts I read in research were these very straight-faced, very, very completely sincere taxonomies of demonology in daily life, and some very influential texts. I mean, This Present Darkness was this wildly best-selling evangelical novel in the 80s and 90s that really talked about Satan and demons like taking over an American town in just these super literal ways. Like, the pastor's wife is trying to get out of the parking lot while some shady goon is approaching her, and like an angel is fighting a demon over the parking brake. I mean, it's really, really literal. And yeah, I mean, this, once again, like, this is when people say this is what they believe, I think it's worthwhile to take that as then a given, a premise, right? And then if you're take that to its logical conclusion, if you believe you're fighting demons and the forces of Satan, a multitude of sins how far would you go to defeat Lucifer, right? Like, if you believe that contemporary politics is a haunting ground of demons, right? And that you and your Christian compatriots are the only forces keeping Lucifer from total victory over the US. How far would you be willing to go? Quite far. And I think that kind of understanding of the authoritarian impulse on the Christian right is worthwhile to understand, because if you're looking for their limits, like, the answer is, again, just like, how far would you go to beat Satan? And the answer is quite far indeed. And as to the Satanic Panic, I mean, yeah, it's like you look back at these cases and you're like, this is crazy. These people imprisoned for like flying with goats and blood and all this horrible, like, prompting of really young kids with the cooperation not just of the Christian right, but also like the DOJ and sorry, even some elements of the feminist and victims' rights movements were like, okay, like, finally we're taking child sexual abuse seriously. It just was this really unfortunate confluence of different elements of the American body politic. America as a whole still doesn't take sexual abuse of kids, particularly incest, like, seriously, and it's really epidemic. The other thing I'll say about it is that I firmly believe, like, moral panics never really die. They just, like, hibernate. They're cyclical. And the Satanic Panic in particular has really come back in a big way in the last number of years. If you're talking about, and it's shifted slightly, but it's this, like, now it's about grooming kids, but like, there's also quite a bit of, like, literal demonology. I mean, I think it was the Utah House that literally like last year passed a law against ritual abuse of children, which again is just like not a thing that's ever happened in any widespread way in the US at all. And I think Louisiana did as well. So you have right now, people who are like believe the satanic panic was totally real. And B, that it's still happening, that satanic ritual abuse of children is very much still happening. And, guard yourself. It's really this worldview that's sort of saturated with menace and paranoia on this like spiritual level, but also, that has immense consequences for day-to-day life. And I think it helps explain how extreme these positions get, how heated these school board discussions get, when you're talking about, should I be surrendering my child to the influence of demons or not?
Yeah. By the way, you mentioned Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth in your book. And I have that book. I read this book. Here it is. I got it right off my shelf, but I saw you wrote about that. This is from when I was in college. It's the 1973 edition. 2 million copies in print. And I see he's still, at least last time I checked, maybe a year or two ago, he's still on the air talking about the end is nigh. It's like, well, when's it coming? You've been saying this, since the 70s. Anyway.
America has a very long tradition of prophets making grandiose claims, and then when their claims don't come true, they're like, well, I went back and reconsulted the text, and turns out it was such and such.
Forgot to carry the one. It's next year.
Yeah, and you can do that as many times as you want. I mean, as long as you have a willing enough flock.
Yeah.
The point is to like constantly suffuse life with this sort of other realm, with this sort of intense paranoiac meaning. I think people really hunger for that. Possibly not the audience of Skeptic, but and for myself, like I find other sources of meaning as well. But for many people, there is an innate desire to be part of something bigger than themselves, to be in service of light, in service of a life beyond life, right? Immortality, like religion has been appealing to people's sense of mortality, a sense of smallness, desire for an ordered and understandable world for a very long time. And I think we dismiss the power of these desires and needs at our peril.
Right. All right. You talk about the 7 mountains of societal influence: the arts and entertainment, business, education, family, government, media, and religion. So does this come from some sort of formal plan, sort of like a Project 2025, which we just published an article by Catherine Stewart on that last week? Something like that, or did it evolve just sort of from the bottom up organically?
I mean, the people who were behind this 7 Mountains mandate, which comes from, like, again, Revelation is a really, really weird book, and it's also very much at the center of evangelical American Christianity. Like it occurs just again and again and again. Revelation is great because you can map whatever you want onto it. It's like, a series of somewhat hallucinatory images, but they're all very, again, like dark, suffused with prophetic, menace, right? And it's about the end of the world, right? So it's very popular. So at some point, 7 mountains are mentioned in Revelation. I think it's again, her 7 heads were 7 mountains or whatever. So one of the founders of Campus Crusade for Christ then takes that and talks about the 7 mountain mandate, where Christians should acquire immediate temporal power over these 7 mountains. Like you said, government, culture, media, entertainment. And so this is very much a mandate for creating a kingdom of Christ on earth. this is sort of a viewpoint of like, let's create the preconditions for Christ's return by creating a Christian paradise in America. And that paradise is not so much paradise for everybody else. So, one thing that I've come up against a lot is like, this like free speech movement is so hypocritical because, when conservatives or Christians really overstep their authority to ban opposing viewpoints, they don't say anything. And then when like leftists or secular folks criticize religion or espouse left-wing views, the sort of and get censored or fired, like this crowd rejoices or just doesn't say anything. I think, again, if you look at this all from the context of this realpolitik, of this will to power, this will to conquest, it makes perfect sense. We explicitly want to dominate these, like all spheres of American public life, for the service of God, so Jesus will return, so Satan will be defeated. I mean, that excuses a multitude of sins. And, that kind of will to power in the service of God also explains why, in a culture that emphasizes the submissive nature of women and how women should be sort of quiet and chaste and modest and submissive to their husbands, there have been so many prominent female leaders, from Phyllis Schlafly to the modern sort of trad wife figures, who are very visible, who are very prominent, who speak out in favor of submission. And again, all of the stuff that appears to be rank hypocrisy from the outside makes perfect sense when you're like, we have to use a diversity of tactics in a holy war. That, your ministry is such and such, and this is how you contribute to Christ's return. So it makes, a great deal of sense in its own context.
Yeah. There's an internal logic to it. Right. That makes sense. So let's just go through some of these specific ones. U.S. support for Israel, for example. There's a branch of your people, you study the Christian right, who are doing so not out of, we want to support the only democracy in the Middle East, or, the Jews have a right to have their own nation, particularly after the Holocaust, but for biblical reasons. What are those reasons?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, first of all, a lot of it is like sanitized as the former. But if you look closely at, for example, how Christian commentators reacted to the breakout of war, which we're coming up on the anniversary of, a lot of it was this really ghoulish ecstasy of, there's this description of Israel that's very popular in evangelical circles as God's timepiece. And you see that reflected in Hal Lindsey and in many subsequent sort of imitators, in the Left Behind series, in, all of these mass market Christian publications that have fundamentally a lot more influence than your average sermon. This is what your people are reading at church camp. This is what you're passing around. It's sort of this parallel culture, right? But yeah, very central to evangelical prophetic ideas of Jesus' return, of revelation and prophecy. Lindsey in particular talks about biblical prophecy as history written in advance, and that it has to be taken very literally. Of course, his interpretations are, their own affairs. John Hagee of Christians United for Israel is also a hugely prominent figure in this stuff. He wrote a book called like Countdown to Armageddon or something like that in 2006. Basically, all of them postulate that a precondition for Jesus's return is that Israel is in the hands of Jews, and all the Jews go back to Israel. So like someone like me living in New York, well, I'd just have to go to Jerusalem, right? Then when Jesus comes back, he will be able to convert all the Jews. And those who refuse to convert will be cast into a fiery pit. So functionally, it's a deeply anti-Semitic fantasy of annihilation. Annihilation either through literally being cast down into a fiery pit or through disappearing into the mass of sort of the saved, the Christians, the erasure of Jewish identity. And this is viewed as sort of this prophetic milestone. And so, and also there are a great many, because these are like many of the prophetic texts that they're referencing are like Isaiah and Jeremiah. A lot of them focus on bloodshed in the ancient country of Israel because that's who they were prophesying to, and that was their context, right? But you have these almost like palpably bloodthirsty descriptions of like, and then there's going to be a war in Israel that's so violent that people will have to wade through corpses and the stench of corpses will be everywhere, and then Jesus will come back. And that's part of this this Christian philosophy called premillenarian dispensationalism, which is a mouthful, but basically certain things have to happen and we can influence it so that Jesus will come back. And then we'll have this like millennium of peace. But one of those preconditions is Jews owning Israel and Jews all being concentrated in Israel so that they can be converted / die en masse. So yeah, it's a very dark fantasy. And these Christians united for Israel, for the most part, are really Christians united for the moment where Jesus comes back and destroys all of Jewry.
That is
I'm
so
not a fan.
Yeah, you're not a fan. Well, I can see why, because it is, I hadn't really thought of it that way. It is kind of an eliminationist worldview. In other words, why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Savior and Messiah? They believe in the same God, Yahweh. They believe in the same book, at least the Old Testament. And they even believe that there will be a Messiah. They just don't think it was the carpenter from Nazareth, right? Because I'm always asking Christians who I debate who claim that the resurrection really happened, literally, and that Jesus really is the Messiah. How come Jews don't accept it then? Because they believe the same stuff I just rattled off. And their answer is, well, they just don't understand the arguments, or if they would convert if they really, grasp what we're saying here. And to which I respond, you mean these learned rabbis in history, some of the smartest people around, don't understand your arguments? Of course they do. They just don't think you have very good evidence for it. But anyway, I guess the ultimate thing would be if they're standing there in Jerusalem and there's Jesus, he's standing right there, or they get uplifted to heaven or whatever, then they would convert. So there would be no more Jews. They'd be Christians.
Yeah. I mean, what you're the sort of like Jews are just stunted Christians who never evolved the final step.
Right.
Is a very common Christian viewpoint. And there's, a related and ancillary ideology called supersessionism, which, we just call it the Torah and they call it the Old Testament. I'm like, it's not, it's just the Bible, like for me, right? Not that I'm a great believer. I just get my hackles up when people are, basically say, Jews are just like too benighted and too stupid to understand that Jesus truly was the Messiah. I've certainly been, when you say you're Jewish to evangelicals, they get so excited. You're like a snack. You're just like the most delicious possible convert. I still get emails from
you do? That's funny.
this. I mean, there was a Christian far right, explicitly Christian far right fundraising website called Give, Send, Go. And I did a profile of the founders for The Nation like years ago. I still get emails from them being like, I hope you found the light of Jesus. I hope that you'll consider our truth. And I'm like, still good on that, still okay, but it's so aggressive. And like, there's a very common, but it's like, as I write in the book, it's like a Christian loves a Jew like a hungry man loves a chicken wing. It's this very utilitarian view
Yeah.
of us. Like, we have this special place in their grim, bloody views of prophecy. And yeah, like they get so excited about the idea of converting a Jew. Like the like evangelicals stop being incredibly weird about Jews challenge is impossible. They fail like every minute. I mean, just today there was like a trend on social media of like, oh, like we've heard about rising anti-Semitism, so like we Christians are going to put a mezuzah, which is a Jewish sacred object, that we put on our doors, to sort of say like a Jew lives here. This is a Jewish house. They're saying we're going to put mezuzahs on our doors because we're showing solidarity, and every Jew I know is like, don't do that. Like that's weird. That's ours. Stop doing that. Like you're not. Like, I don't know, like they're obsessed with the idea that they're persecuted and like want to just like, ugh, it's just gross. It's like, I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm getting too irrational and religious for your
No,
listeners,
it's all
I
right.
suspect. I think there's just an element of appropriation here that I'm like, you've been pogrumming us for like 1,000 years, and now you're like, oh, like I'll put up a mezuzah. We'll do a Seder. And like, this is just, you're just stealing and then calling
cultural
it virtue.
appropriation, right?
Yeah, like it's gross. Like it's my hashtag my Zaza, your Zaza. And I was like, it's not your Zaza. It's not.
Yeah, that's funny.
It's, yeah. I mean, like, for me, it's interesting. Like, I knew pretty early on that, like, age 9, I grew up Orthodox. So I grew up quite religious in a quite religious family. Not like ultra Orthodox Hasidic. I like went to Harvard, I had like, but certainly Sabbath observant, prayers were gender segregated, all like very obedient to all the laws of kashrut, and all the stuff. It was suffused every element of my daily life. I grew up in a very heavily Jewish town. All of my early education was in Orthodox schools. And from about age 9, I remember like standing in the shul at Yom Kippur and just saying like, don't think anyone's
really?
And really feeling that very early on. Now, what's interesting to me, and I think a very sharp contrast with Christianity, is that you can very much go on being a Jew without believing in God. Like, that's like a very normal position. We don't put the same imprimatur or emphasis on faith, even within Orthodoxy. Like, it's like, as long as you keep kosher and you like pray and you follow the laws, like not believing, your sort of internal state of belief is really not a primary focus at all. Like, and I'm talking about like, I had very comprehensive, full religious schooling for my entire childhood, and I don't really remember like long discussions of faith. It just wasn't a thing. And when you compare that to Christianity, and its focus on like faith over works, and this constant profession of faith, and these altar calls, and this sort of born again kind of belief, it's always been interesting to me. And I think for me, like, I'm able to relate to religion as a sort of set of sociological conditions, or responses to these very human urges and desires, because my religion, the religion I grew up with, like, was fundamentally a material and social culture much more than it was sort of an obsession with faith and belief. So I do like a mezuzah. I like all of these beautiful sort of preserved ancient rituals that I look at and I'm like, that's really cool. Like swinging a chicken around your head before Yom Kippur to like put your sins on the chicken, or like waving around a citron and a myrtle frond as we're about to do 2 weeks from now or so for the holiday of Sukkot, right? And like eating in booths, not eating leaven. Like it's very concrete, the stuff we do. And for me, I just see it as like, this is kind of nifty. And there are all kinds of ways to parse it and all the stuff.
So you're a secular Jew.
Yeah, yeah. Or just like, yeah, I'm someone who left a faith and spent a very long time dealing with the consequences of that, and then came to appreciate it from afar. I don't mean to like just ramble, but
Oh no, this is super fascinating. This is one of the things I am into. I mean, most of my scientist and philosopher friends are atheists that are Jewish or atheists, but they call themselves secular Jews, or they admire the religion or respect the holidays and so forth. Why is it that Jews don't have the sense of missionary work, of spreading the faith and converting other people and so on, like so many other Christian denominations do?
Well, first of all, we're not a Christian denomination. It's like an important.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another fundamental difference and perhaps a reason for the de-emphasis on faith, and why it's perfectly normal to say, like, I'm an atheist and a Jew, is because we've never been a proselytizing religion, like never, not even from the beginning. And in fact, the process of converting to Judaism, certainly under an Orthodox milieu, but even in more sort of permissive denominations, is like, are you sure? And you have to ask multiple times, and you have to go through like these sort of courses and learn, and this culminates in a ceremony, but it's a very long process, and it's people are sort of rejected. It's like, why would you want to do this to yourself? Like, are you sure? And it's not because it's like, I think fundamentally it's just this idea of like, we don't go around. The closest we have to like a proselytizing sect is the Chabad sect of Hasidim, who proselytize only to Jews, of just like, hey, you like secular Jew, you should be, observing religious tradition. You should be maybe believing in God. You should be following the mitzvot. So it's an internal proselytization called kiruv, or bringing closer. And so I don't know. I mean, this is more or less just ancillary, but I think writing this book as someone who grew up in a world totally motivated, an insular world totally motivated by religion, I think I came to it with more of an understanding. But the fact that it was a different religion, that I didn't have a competing vision of Jesus, that I was trying to sort of superimpose, I think was also an aid to the writing.
Oh yeah, for sure. You know what it's like to be in that worldview and that mindset, much like I was when I was a born again evangelical Christian for 7 years. I went to Pepperdine University. I went door to door for a while, although I never really liked doing that. It takes a certain kind of temperament to want to do that, and I didn't have that. But yeah, but now when I debate Christians, I was like, oh, I know exactly what they're thinking, because I used to think this. It does bring some insight, I think. By the way, when I was writing my book on the Holocaust deniers, I did sort of like what you did, join a bunch of these different groups, some of which ended up being these kind of white supremacist, neo-Nazi type groups where, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And one of the weirdest things I heard was, the Jews killed our Lord, Jesus. Like, well, he was Jewish, right? There were no Christians at the time. And furthermore, if you believe that Jesus had to die for your sins, for the original sin and all that, so you could be saved, John 3:16, so God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, and so on and so forth. So why wouldn't you celebrate the Jews helping bring about this inevitable thing that had to happen for all of us to be saved? I always thought that was kind of weird.
I mean, for me, I'm just like, cool, that's why they killed us and killed us and killed us and killed us and killed us. Like, there's so many
Pogroms,
Jews died on the back of that.
Yeah.
Canard. So for me, like with a very close family history of that kind of like Christians doing murder. It's a little less funny to me.
Yeah.
But I'm just like, where are the Romans in this situation? Why
Yeah,
hasn't there
right.
been like a 1,000-year Christian vendetta against Italians?
Yeah,
Like,
right.
like it was the Roman Empire that had this very, very long tradition of crucifixion. That's attested to in like many, many contemporary Latin sources. It was like a standard issue kind of punishment, and like it was Pontius Pilate even in those texts who like carried out the death sentence. So
Right.
we didn't nail the cross together. What are you talking about? So
Yeah. Yeah.
that whatever.
But
That
it's a,
canard, I don't. Yeah, I mean, like the sort of Christ killer epithet, is one of the oldest forms of Christian anti-Semitism and formed sort of the impetus for countless pogroms, and also just prejudice in day-to-day life. And certainly, I have relatives who are older who experience being called Christ killers. Who are not raised in an Orthodox bubble. I've been called a Christ killer myself. I'm like, well, I wasn't there at the time.
yeah. Yeah.
But it's just it's this very pernicious canard. I would also say anti-Semitism. This is going back to some of the material from my previous book, but anti-Semitism forms a really interesting has a really interesting role in neo-Nazi ideologies and far-right ideologies and sort of conspiratorial ideologies. It's interesting because it is in and of itself murderous, and we're talking about synagogue shooters and people who send death threats to Jews and who fantasize about massacring Jews, right? But it also has this structural role where in neo-Nazi ideologies, it's sort of like it's like people of color are too inherently sort of stupid and racially inferior to organize for their own rights. It must be a Jewish plot.
Mm.
So that's where the sort of Jews will not replace us chant came in Charlottesville. It wasn't about like Jews like literally replacing them in like their jobs or whatever. It was Jews are behind the scenes arranging for a mass influx of immigrants in order to dilute the white population, destroy the white majority, and thus like more easily control the more stupid and malleable people of color that will then be the majority. I mean, it's like super racist. It's called Great Replacement Theory.
Yeah.
But it also is indicative of like just the sort of scaffolding role that anti-Semitism plays. It's like if you look at their views on like gay rights, trans rights, anything they don't like about the modern world. And then, the question is sort of like, why isn't the world more aligned with our values, which are natural and which are, sort of the way humanity should be? And the answer is always, it's a Jewish plot. I mean, it's like this utilitarian, all-purpose answer. And I've seen it, I've seen it's a Jewish plot deployed as the answer to like, why does NASA say the Earth is round? To, why are more kids coming out as trans? I mean, it's really just this very all-purpose answer. So that's a little bit afield from our original topic of discussion.
Well, that's
but
okay.
it is
We're just bouncing around here. I have been disturbed by the kind of spike in anti-Semitism since October 7th last year. Because it seems to go beyond legitimate criticisms of the Israeli government or Netanyahu, which, most of my Jewish friends feel he has to go, and that the disproportional response by Israel, is a legitimate form of criticism. But the kind of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel sentiment seems much stronger than just the normal criticism of Israeli policies, particularly on college campuses, particularly since liberals traditionally over the last half century have been pretty supportive of Jews, as a minority group who have a long history of being oppressed. this is one of the things that liberals do. They support and help lift up oppressed peoples, and the Jews are one of those. And it wasn't that long ago that, there was most country clubs, most colleges and universities were restricted. Jews were not allowed. It wasn't really until maybe the 60s and 70s when that began to change. That's not that long ago. So I'm kind of surprised by this turn, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It's not a topic I'd want to dwell on at super great length. But I think I have a mixed reaction. I think people protesting a genocide on college campuses being saying transgressive things is not especially shocking to me. I think it's a bit overreported. I think even the vast majority of American Jews, even the ones who are sort of at their most on guard at this moment, will acknowledge that, sort of the deadly type of anti-Semitism is far more likely to arise on the right. I think people have strong reactions to massacre and mass starvation and introducing polio into the Gazan population.
Wait,
and we've seen this.
I wasn't aware of that. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah. There's polio in the water over there. It's terrible.
Oh.
People these kids have typhus. The conditions are awful. That being said, on the left, I consider myself a leftist and sort of am part of that milieu. I've seen some shit that's just come on, what are you talking about? You're really gonna start using the phrase Zionist occupied government? That's literally a Nazi phrase. What are you talking about? Mm-hmm. That being said, I think if we're looking at this from a viewpoint of power analysis or what phenomena are worth highlighting or worth paying tons of attention to, I think there's sort of a disproportionate focus on shitty speech acts among relatively powerless people. Like Columbia freshmen are not, in massive positions of power right now.
That's true. Yes. What are they going to do
first of all,
besides
that,
protest?
Second of all, it's it's a very small percentage of the college population at elite institutions that get disproportionate amounts of press attention because everyone in the press went to the same 3 schools. So North Carolina State is not up in arms over Gaza necessarily, in the same way. So I think, any uptick in anti-Semitism, certainly when I see it among my comrades, I'm just stop that. Please, it sucks. And it makes me feel disenfranchised, among my political tribe. Stop that nonsense. On the other hand, I think it's always important to pay attention to what's the sort of power level of the people we're obsessing about and critiquing and focusing on, which is not to excuse prejudice, but rather and I hate it. I hate encountering it, but also I'm just why are we focusing on one college campus at the expense of so many other things? I think it's a relatively minor problem, especially given the way the American government is responding to this, the way people in power are responding to this. So I think that's worth pointing out, perhaps.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's over reporting on both sides of extreme examples. That's why I was wondering about what percentage of say conservatives are of this Christian right. I mean, there are the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world who just to me come off as these wingnuts. How many people really are in that go that far? So yeah. All right. Before we
Well, I
kind of
mean, when we
yeah,
started out with me
yeah,
being like, yeah, it's 14% of the population. It's
right,
millions of
right.
people.
Yeah, that's a
First of all,
lot.
the
Yeah,
answer is millions. Second of all, again, like through a power analysis lens, these people have disproportionate power,
yeah,
punch way above their weight class
yeah, yeah.
in terms of setting the agenda of the Republican Party, and because they've spent the last 50 years like very explicitly following through on an agenda of building up temporal and secular power and really trying everything, throwing everything at the wall, like seeing what sticks. Oh, okay, we started out as segregationists and then we're going to try this abortion stuff. Oh, that's resonating. And now we have this femicidal government in almost half the states of the US with very much a promise, should Trump be reelected, to make that 50 out of 50.
Femicidal. What is that?
Killing women.
Killing women. Okay. How are they doing that?
Abortion laws kill women.
Oh, I see. I see. Right. Okay.
Not to mention that the GOP has also been signaling, like Mike Johnson, GOP figures like Mike Johnson, but also lots of different state parties have been talking about opposition to no-fault divorce. It's just too darn easy to get divorced in the U.S., apparently. Because marriage is a sacrament and we should treat marriage very seriously. And this is explicitly a Christian viewpoint that they're espousing. So, no-fault divorce was like a 3-decade fight to enact. And as soon as those laws came into effect, the amount of women who were killed by their spouses went down dramatically. Domestic violence went down dramatically. So that, I would say, is also part of a femicidal agenda.
Yeah. Well, on that issue of abortion and marriage and family and so on, why is it that Christians seem to want to control female sexuality? What's behind all that, do you think?
I mean, misogyny. There are huge elements of misogyny in many religions, Christianity very much being one of them.
But what do you
yeah,
mean?
I mean,
What do you mean by misogyny? You mean, but they don't hate women. What do you mean by misogyny?
yeah, they're literally like women introduced sin into the world and have been punished ever since.
You mean Eve?
Yeah, and also like women should be submissive and obedient to their husbands. I mean, read Paul. That's a misogynistic text. Like, yeah, Christians hate women. Absolutely.
But if you ask them, why are you pro-life, they'll say, because abortion is murder. You're taking a human life. And if you said it's because you hate women, they'll go, no, we love women.
Okay. I mean, yeah, like if you ask me why I don't take out the garbage, I'll say I'm just too busy. In reality, like, I don't feel like it. You know what I mean? Like people lie all the time, or just like are not even fully cognizant of their own motivations. I think to ignore the misogyny at the center of this movement, this obsessive control over sexuality, this demonization, literally and figuratively, of women who have sex and of sex for pleasure. I recently had like some Christian opponent to something I was going to say. I was saying, talk about consequence-free sex being a problem. And I'm like, you want sex to have consequences. That's weird. Like, what's the issue with like sex not having devastating consequences? I think there is a punitive element. And also when you control, I mean, for me, I'm an absolutist about bodily autonomy. I think if you don't control your own body, if there are laws restricting your uterus as like a controlled substance, you are not a free and equal citizen of the United States. And essentially the views espoused again by just like all of these state governments is every woman is sort of a potential for a fetus, or you know, like is sort of a future or past potential like breeding ground.
Are you encouraged? I just looked up some numbers. Are you encouraged by this? That Pew survey found 62, this was last year, 62% of U.S. adults say the practice abortion should be legal in all or most cases. 36% said it should be illegal in all or most cases. A Gallup poll last year, 54% pro-choice, 41% pro-life. Another one, yeah, I mean, you still have pro-choicers still have the majority. And in the midterms, the extremists in some of those elections who wanted to ban abortions almost entirely didn't fare well. So it looks like the majority of people in the pro-choice camp are having their way politically. Are you encouraged by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time abortion has come up on a ballot, whether, statewide, in lots of different states, including very red ones, abortion has won. Access to abortion has won. That being said, I'm a little like what you see in response to that is Republican efforts to then make sure these referenda are kept off the ballot. Subversion of these referenda ex post facto. And I think that's related to an overall anti-democratic movement on the right in general, where you have, all sorts of, like messing with the polls, messing with voter ID laws, making it harder for people to vote. Like the response to our policies are theocratic and unpopular, is to then make it harder for the popular will to be expressed. And again, I think this comes down to the framework of holy war, spiritual warfare, and any tactic being permissible in a war against the devil.
So this would also explain that attitudes toward prostitution and pornography. I mean, if Republicans are pro-liberty and freedom and autonomy and choice, what's wrong with consenting adults doing whatever they want to do in the privacy of their bedrooms? Why those particular issues they also want to control?
I don't think Republicans are pro-liberty and
yeah, I agree.
Choice.
They're not. Yeah.
I think they're panty sniffers who want the government to be in your bedroom. It's gross and it's weird.
But why?
Because they're theocrats.
They're theocrats. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, if you're, there's no one more pruriently interested in sex and controlling it than people who are trying to enact an overtly religious agenda. And they're coming after all of it. I mean, birth control, gay marriage, every element of human sexuality that can be controlled by the government under a theocracy, which is explicitly, again, what the Seven Mountain Mandate is all about, and what, all of the sort of flood of theocrat judges is all about. All of this concrete accumulation of power is for the goal of explicitly enacting this very invasive, very unpopular, and very creepy Christian agenda to control and sublimate and violate people's sexual autonomy and bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
The sort of small government Rockefeller Republic, that's a very, at this moment, not a particularly relevant figure to what where the GOP mainstream is right now.
Well, you've certainly brought that to the fore with your book, and that's what the Battle of Ideas is all about. Put it out there, and then we can respond in kind. Yeah. All right, Talia. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your book, and thanks for talking to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what a pleasure. And again, the book is out October 15th. Wild Faith: How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. Thank you so much for your time.
Yep, there it is. Let me show the cover one more time. Here we go. Wild Faith.
Yeah, cool snake. Look at the cool snake.
It is a cool.